Thanks for coming. Great turnout. I'm Lina from the gallery. I work at the gallery. And just to introduce Amanda Renshaw, who is a curator and has been working on work with Anthony Caro and his works for a long time. She's edited a massive publication on his work, which we've got on the front desk if you want to have a look at it. And she's also curated the exhibition that is at the moment at Cliverton Estate, which shows, I don't know how many works there are, 16 outdoor works. And this is Patrick Cunningham, who's been Tony's assistant and then later on studio director, and has worked with him for over 50 years now. And he's been obviously very involved with our show and also with the Cliverton show. And I thought we'd start off by talking about Tony's relationship with sculpture and how you sort of started with him and what your first impressions were with him and your sort of history with Tony and his work.
Well, I met Tony in 1968. I worked in a small engineering factory in West Hampstead. And he came in to have a sculpture made, welded up and spray painted, and I got the job. And that's when we first met. And then 6 months later, he invited me to come and work for him. And the rest is history. It's been a long 50 years. We've made a lot of sculpture together and had great times. I miss him terribly, but it's great to be here and talking about his sculpture show. If you have any questions, fire them.
Yes, I don't know if you've seen, hopefully you'll be able to see downstairs, where it's the early work starting from the 1950s and the 60s and 70s and 80s are, I think, only up here. So it's up to the 70s downstairs. And maybe you could talk a little bit about, especially I think the early works that are in the back room, because they're quite different, sort of almost figurative, and also the drawings.
Yes, Tony, as most people probably know, Tony was an assistant to Henry Moore, and him and Henry had a very close relationship. Henry was very fond of Tony, and when Tony and Henry would come into town from Matchhaddon, Tony would drive him in, and then he'd go to the Royal Academy and do the drawing classes. And then in that evening on the way home, Henry would say, Tony, what did you do today, Tony? And Tony would say, well, I was at the academy and these are the drawings. And then he would look at the drawings and he'd write on the side of them, correct them. So this is, you've got to get it more like this. So he was a big influence on Tony. But then in the 60s came along, Tony went to America and met people like Clement Greenberg and Helen Frankenthaler and Ken Nolan and people, David Smith, and then came back and started to make the new sculptures of the 60s. And they were abstract sculptures, but not related to the figure at all. And I think people found it quite difficult to Amanda can talk more about this.
Yes, so in 1959 he met Clement Greenberg, I think here first. Clement Greenberg went to his studio, and in that same year he won a Ford grant to go to America and Mexico, which is where, so he was very excited to go to the States. He would have seen lots of American painters' work when they were exhibited at the Tate and things like that, but it was his first trip to America. And so he was very excited, yes, and he met Helen Frankenthaler, Jasper Johns, Robert Motherwell, David Smith, Kenneth Noland, and it was a watershed for him, a real watershed. He went into this incredible world of, gone from Henry Moore, figurative sculptor, to the world of enormous canvases that were all abstract, and he came across all these artists who weren't painting on easels, but were actually painting on the floor. So Helen Frankenthaler would roll out her canvases and paint directly on the floor, on the canvas on the floor, and Kenneth Nolan, I think, put them on, he had his canvases laid out on sort of like a workbench, on trestles. And that really influenced Tony. In fact, he made his first sculptures when he came back from America on the floor. He was a sort of collage artist in a way, so he had all these disparate parts and he would collect, and I'm sure Pat, who knows Tony inside out much better than I do and can tell you all the personal, intimate stories, which I can't tell. But he would find all these disparate parts of metal and plowshares, and he even had parts that were from David Smith's studio that were sent to him after David Smith died, which he would then lay out on the ground at home and then later on in the studio, and then that would then be welded together and made into a sculpture and then also painted. But yes, 1959 was the watershed for Caro, yeah.
And then we have downstairs, as you have seen, the sort of I would like to either you or you talk a little bit about the significance of taking, as you've already started, taking the sculpture off the plinth, but also some of the sculptures that are seen downstairs and also actually in the room here that are sort of falling off the plinth or hanging off the plinth. So it's almost, I think initially, if I'm correct, if I remember this correctly, is that he started doing the works on the ground without a plinth at all, and then the works that are sort of falling off the plinth or hanging off the plinth came a little bit after that. But maybe you can talk a little bit about the significance.
The first sculpture we made was 24 hours, and it was made from parts from an old bridge, because it had pop rivets and things in it. You could see it had another use. There was scrap metal, and he brought it in the studio, made it. I wasn't with him then, but later on, when he made table pieces that would sit on the edge of the table, were all part of the table. He didn't want them to be seen as little maquettes for something bigger, so he would put a little scissor handle or a pair of scissor clips into it that give it scale and stuff.
Yes. I mean, he was conscientiously, after his trip to America, he didn't reproduce the human form, which he'd done up until that date. However, I do think, you correct me Pat, if you think I'm wrong, I think that the human scale is always in his sculpture.
Yes.
And I think that every sculpture that he made has a kind of character that a human being might have. In fact, if you go into the early room, and it's downstairs, it's downstairs at the back, there's a little guy in there, he's so big, he's about this tall, a little warrior, and he's a guy holding two spears or something, and he is imbued with so much emotion and power. You can really feel this person, the person that's in there. And I think, and that's what he was doing in the 1950s, all the sculptures that he made are really imbued with the physicality of a body. And I think even now as you walk and look at all these sculptures that are so different and completely disparate, they all have their own character, which almost makes them, to me, like human. I have this terrible, I'm sure Pat will criticise me for doing this, but I call them some are he's and some are she's. You know, they really have their own characters. But sorry, that wasn't answering your question about tables.
It's all right.
I think. Can I keep going?
Yes, please.
You're on a roll.
I think Tony was sort of. I think he was like an explorer, and he found this three-dimensional world, and he wanted to kind of map and investigate every single nook and cranny of it. And when something was accepted, he then decided that, oh gosh, it's accepted and people like this, I've got to try something else. And so he would turn around and try something different. So he was forever breaking boundaries and trying to do things, conscientiously trying to do things and investigating new ways of making sculpture. So yes, he took things off the pedestal and put them on the ground. He painted them all a single colour, so all those disparate parts that he tacked together, he would make, by painting them in one colour, he would make the whole homogeneous, like a single whole, once he painted all these disparate parts. When people started liking the colour, he stopped painting them in colour. When other people started putting things on the floor, he decided he would put things on a table, or even hung them from the ceiling. So he was sort of contrary in that way, I think. He always wanted to turn a bend when everybody was going straight.
Absolutely. And also the table piece in there is one that sort of sits on the table, get cascades down the floor. And he made a whole series of those without that pouring off the table. You know, so it connects with the floor and the table.
Yes, yes.
That's a new way of working. But Tony was very influenced by his material and stuff. He loved to he would change, material could change him. When he'd be going across over to lunch in the gallery, we had a lot of big areas, steel in the yard, and he would walk over and he'd say, he'd put an X on it, and he said, could you take that into the studio? No explanation of what it was or what's going to happen to it. And then it would sit on the studio floor, and then he might say, well, could you get it up here? You'd lift it up and hold it up there for him, and then the sculpture could start from that point. You know, it's a funny place to start, but somehow he made sense of it all, and the sculptures would come out. And, you know, hence he would have something as big as this.
And he'd be working on several
Lots. He loved working on lots. He liked the way the studio was run. When he had 4 or 5 things ready, then we would have the guys like Ed and Howell who worked for us. They weren't working full time in the studio. We'd send them down to their studios and have them made down there. They'd only have a week to make them and get them back, because Tony was impatient to see them. You know, he wanted to see how it turned out. And then he would change them and send them back down again for another change. So it was an ongoing process.
So he was somebody who had a very clear sense of what he wanted, but he also sometimes changed his mind, right?
Very much so.
Yeah.
But he was never, I mean, you know, if he looked at a painting, say, like the Seven of the Cross after Rembrandt or Rubens that he made, he'd look at the book and then he'd start the sculpture. The book get closed, put away, and then the sculpture would take over. So it was the sculpture talking back to Tony in a sense. And then all the changes that we'd made because he was looking at the sculpture. Then he'd say, I'm happy with that, now go ahead and make it.
Yeah.
And then when it was made, it was clarified for him because it was all welded up and the end were all brown. Then he'd look at it again and change it again. But they never, you know, when is the sculpture finished? With Johnny, it could be 4 or 5 years later. And you'll notice that in the dates of some of them.
Yes. Yeah.
They go from 78 to 85. Well, they started in 78, they were finished, and then he decided to change it again in 85.
And when he worked on these, the sort of the last works, the perspex pieces, and also the sort of smaller book sculptures and some of the small bronzes,
Yes.
that are not in the exhibition, there's some in the catalogue, I think, but what I find interesting is that he went for, I mean, to me, the book sculptures couldn't be more different to the perspex sculptures, yet they were sort of done around about the same time.
Yes.
And how did he, I know he got some frustrated waiting for the perspex to be finished, and
That was a fill-in. So while you were waiting to see this, come back and see it in reality.
But they're so different in the material and also visually.
Yeah, but when he was working on the perspex was very different, because each piece of perspex we used to use an MDF board to simulate the flats and the planes. Then we would get the perspex made, and the perspex is not solid colour, it's a laminate of colour, because it was Sheila and him worked very hard on getting the colour right. And it'd be a big surprise when the perspex would come back, and then he would end up having to change the metal part of the sculpture again, because it wasn't, he couldn't see through it before when it was MDF. And now it's something that's transparent, you can see through it. But the bronzes were great fun to make. Actually, the little funny badge, what I call the bag-shaped bronzes, it was Sheila's handbag, was sitting on the floor. And Tony said, look to Olivia, look at that. Could you make me that in wax? Took lots of photographs of it, and that's when he began to make these wax books and handbags and things.
He was sort of a sponge, really, wasn't he? Everything that he looked at.
Yes, he saw sculpture and everything.
Yes. Whether it was painting,
Yes.
collage, materials.
Or material, as a material, he's seen everything. I remember we were in Rome together doing a show in Rome. And there was this old Vespers exhaust pipe lying on the road that cars had driven over. And Tony said, look at that, isn't that beautiful? Can you take that back for me? And it's in one of the Trojan War pieces. That bit of steel is in there. He loved steel and material, it was his thing. He loved it. And he had a great memory for material. He would be down in the scrapyard at Harry Pound in Portsmouth, and he would see some great pieces, and he would get up on top and he'd write CARO on the top of it. And 2 years later, he would say, do you remember those big boys we've seen down in Harry Pound? Would you go down and get me 2 of those and bring them back? And, you know, it was always in the back of his mind that he had this stuff to use.
And with the scale of the sculptures, I mean, obviously, when you think of sort of found object steel, to me it makes sense that a lot of the sculptures are of this scale, and which is maybe when we come back to Cliveden also, a lot of the works there are more this scale than the smaller ones. But even in the smaller ones, he used a lot of found objects. Or was he also cutting things down? Or
Yes, yes. He would cut. The part might be much bigger, and he would carve it back. He was a carver, not a builder. Not putting together himself. He would find things and he'd say, "Well, I like that. Cut that off." So he'd just mark it with chalk, and I'd cut it up with the acetylene. And he liked to work quickly. He liked to see the results. And if something was giving him a hard time, he'd just leave it to one side and come back to it another day.
Yeah. And maybe to come back to the bigger sculptures that are shown in Cliveden, maybe Amanda can talk a little bit about how she sort of came up with the idea and how, what made you choose the works that you chose.
I might just go back a little bit, but in the early 1990s, I worked in the Impressionist department at Christie's, and one of the collectors I work with had just bought a publishing company, and he came to me and said, can you come and work for me? Can you come and work for me? I said, well, I don't know the difference between a book publisher, a printer, a distributor, and I don't know how to make books. He said, it doesn't matter. I'd like you to make a list of artists who artists who are living, who have a major importance, a big influence on contemporary art, who don't have a large retrospective book that's in print or easily available. So I started this list, and it had on it Carl Andre, Ellsworth Kelly, Robert Ryman, Anthony Caro, Agnes Martin. And over the next few years, we made this effort to go and visit all these artists, and we ended up making books with them. And Tony was one of these people, and this must have been in the early 90s sometime that we first came to meet him. And ever since then, I've talked to a lot of people, collectors, friends, family, about Caro. Some people find him difficult to like. His work can be very contradictory. One sculpture can look very different from another. Some are more lyrical, some are brutal, some are monumental, some are more domestic. A lot of people find that difficult. And I think the reason why it's like that is because of what we're talking about, is that he was always responding to things and turning those right angles when everybody else was going in a straight line. And I wanted the exhibition at Cliveden to include all those what seem to be contradictory ideas that are in his sculptures. So we have works from every decade of his career, and they were chosen because they had to be able to go outside, so that was one obvious criteria, and they had to be able to stand their own outside as well, which is very difficult. So often, there's one sculpture at Cliveden which is 8 meters wide, and when it was taken off the truck and carried over by crane and put in this space where we decided that it should go, it sort of shrunk. It was a bit of a shock. I thought, oh God, what's it going to look like? But it still looks fantastic and holds its own. And I don't know who have you been to Cliveden. Cliveden is a property that's owned by the National Trust. The grounds are spectacular. There is a house and a parterre that were designed in the 1840s, but the grounds are much older than that, and there were avenues and walkways that were designed and laid out in the 1730s or 40s by somebody called Charles Bridgman. And there's one extraordinary avenue called Green Drive, which is a mile-long avenue of mostly oak and beech trees that are 200 years old. And some of them reach up in height to about 30 meters, and they form this incredible space. It's a bit like the nave of a Gothic cathedral, I think. The trees are like walls or columns, and the crowns of the trees make a kind of ceiling. So there is this space in which the sculpture inhabits this space. Along the Green Drive is also an avenue where thousands of people walk, probably hundreds of thousands of people walk every year. I think they have 600,000 visitors there a year. And so there are always people walking up and down this Green Drive, and we decided together to position the sculptures along the Green Drive so that they also meander along the drive, just like the individuals who walk along the drive. All those human characters are walking with these sculptural characters along the drive. The drive starts, the first work is from the beginning of the 2000s, and the last work is from the same date, and they are completely different. The first work is called Starflight, and it's like an exploding spaceship or something. And it's like a beacon. It's the first sculpture in the drive. Everybody who enters, every member of the public who enters Cliveden has to go past it, so it's obviously there. And you take the walk along the drive starting in 1960 with the second sculpture that Tony made after his return from the US. And you walk along the drive, along this avenue, among the sculptures, going from 1960 all the way down to 2000, and end up with this enormous punctuating red aurora that's from 2003, finished in 2003, which contains one of the boys that Pat mentioned earlier.
From Harry Pound.
From Harry Pound, exactly.